The end of World War II left a world in transformation, one that was both physically and economically exhausted. The airstrips that had once been vital lifelines to waging war, remote airfields scattered across oceans and islands, stood as silent, rusting relics of a conflict now over. These isolated runways, constructed to meet the insatiable demands of wartime aviation, were left abandoned, decommissioned, or repurposed, much like the war machines they had served. The question of what happened to them lies not in the battles they once supported but in the vast and often overlooked process of post-war dismantling. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the global economy was strained. The infrastructure required to maintain an army of millions, an aviation fleet of tens of thousands, and a global supply chain stretched thin. The United States and its allies, particularly, found themselves with a surplus of military assets that were no longer necessary. The need for new weapons and equipment evaporated, and so too did the demand for the military bases that had once been essential to the prosecution of the war. Over 250 airstrips, constructed on remote islands across the Pacific, now found themselves obsolete. The logistics of transitioning from wartime mobilization to peacetime were immense. It was not just a question of what to do with the planes, tanks, and ships. The entire infrastructure that had supported the war effort, from munitions factories to forward bases, needed to be reconfigured or dismantled. Economic pressures quickly became clear. The need to direct funds to rebuilding civilian infrastructure, ensuring national stability, and addressing the dire needs of war-torn populations took precedence. The estimated cost of maintaining a global network of isolated airstrips was simply unsustainable. In some cases, the airstrips had been built in places where maintaining any sort of long-term strategic presence had little value in the new geopolitical reality. The United States, which had built the largest and most numerous of these bases, faced a stark decision. There was no longer the same urgency to keep an airstrip operational on a small Pacific island or in the remote reaches of the Arctic. These airfields were a drain on resources, and with the end of the war, many had been rendered unnecessary by advancements in aviation and the changing nature of military strategy. At the end of the war, a program of demobilization began. Over a span of just a few years, some 1,000 airstrips, initially designed as military strongholds, were either closed, left to decay, or repurposed for civilian use. The fate of these airstrips varied. Some of the most remote sites were simply abandoned. Without a substantial local population to repurpose them, the airfields became deserted. In places like the Marshall Islands and the atolls of the Pacific Ocean, where a handful of personnel had once maintained vast airfields, the structures began to collapse under the relentless heat, humidity, and storms. The paved runways cracked and buckled, and the control towers, once bustling with activity, stood empty, their windows shattered and doors long since rotted away. For others, the transition was more deliberate. Several of the Pacific Islands had been home to strategic military installations, and even after the war, the United States continued to maintain a presence in the region, albeit on a much smaller scale. Some of the larger airstrips were repurposed for civilian aviation, supporting commercial flights or becoming staging areas for humanitarian missions. A few even found new life as regional transportation hubs, offering flights to and from remote island nations. But this was the exception rather than the rule. Most of the smaller airstrips were left to rot. One of the more surprising outcomes for some airfields was their unexpected reuse for scientific purposes. In the Cold War years that followed, several former airstrips became key sites for early space exploration programs and later military surveillance. They had not been dismantled, and their remote locations became assets in the new arms race. However, this reuse was far from the norm, and by the 1960s, many of the island bases had been forgotten or were only faint memories in the annals of military history. Their concrete runways were increasingly covered by vegetation, their hangars overtaken by rust, and their radar towers often toppled or obsolete. Meanwhile, some airstrips on the fringes of conflict zones experienced a different kind of fate. In post-war Europe and Asia, large military airfields were reconfigured for new purposes. Some became home to displaced persons, others served as sites for reconstruction efforts, or were sold off for civilian redevelopment. This process was slower, involving negotiations with local governments or private companies. For example, the former Luftwaffe bases in Germany were repurposed over the years for civilian aviation or integrated into the growing NATO air command network during the Cold War. Despite these shifts in purpose, the overwhelming majority of wartime airstrips, particularly those on remote islands, were abandoned. A few, like those on Midway Atoll, retained some strategic value during the Cold War but were slowly stripped of their military hardware and left to decay in place. The crumbling remnants of airstrips, once symbols of a global conflict, now serve as historical markers, reminders of a war that ended but whose infrastructure remains scattered across the Pacific and beyond. The dismantling process itself was not a swift one. The scale of military bases, especially those in the Pacific and the South Atlantic, was staggering. Take the American base at Enuitak Atoll in the Marshall Islands, which had supported over 100 bombers and countless other military aircraft. It was not just the runways that had to be dealt with but also the vast infrastructure surrounding them, storage tanks for fuel, maintenance facilities, radar equipment, and the materials left behind by a war that had demanded massive industrial outputs. The question became not just what to do with the airstrips but how to dismantle or repurpose the assets in a way that was economically viable. The logistics of scrapping these bases were complex and costly. Many of the structures were built to last, constructed with reinforced concrete to endure constant aircraft landings and harsh weather. Demolition was expensive, requiring specialized equipment and manpower. As a result, much of the material was simply left to deteriorate, or, in the case of some airstrips, it was sealed off and left as is. While some attempts were made to repurpose the metal for scrap, the costs involved in transporting it from remote areas meant that it was not always economically feasible to reclaim the resources. The effort to scrap large military bases in the Pacific, for instance, was also complicated by the physical distance from any major city or port. In other cases, local economies were not prepared to absorb the sudden influx of infrastructure and land, and so the airstrips simply became part of the landscape. On some islands, efforts to reclaim the land for agricultural use were hampered by the fact that the infrastructure was too large, or too integral to the natural environment, to be easily altered. The surrounding environment itself began to encroach, reclaiming the military airstrips slowly but surely. At the same time, the broader question of global economic recovery weighed heavily on the minds of military planners. The vast cost of maintaining airstrips and bases, many of them in the most remote areas of the globe, was increasingly unsustainable. The post-war boom in civilian aviation did little to change this. With the growing availability of commercial airliners and advances in aviation technology, the strategic need for isolated airfields diminished. These islands, once central to the global conflict, were now little more than relics of a past era. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, the last remnants of the wartime airstrips began to vanish. Some were repurposed in ways that gave them new relevance. For others, the process was one of slow abandonment. The global military landscape had changed. The need for far-flung, remote airstrips had vanished with the war that had given them life. The old airfields had no place in the modern world. And yet, the silent runways remain, weathered by time, history, and nature, standing as quiet sentinels of a war that is now long past. The slow, inevitable march of time continued its work, as did the complex task of dismantling or repurposing the remnants of the wartime airstrips. With each passing year, the urgency to reclaim or repurpose these once bustling hubs of military activity waned, overshadowed by the pressing demands of post-war recovery, the changing tides of global politics, and the technological evolution of aviation. However, the fate of these airstrips was far from uniform, and while many simply faded into the landscape, others found new uses, though often far removed from their original wartime purpose. In the 1950s, as the Cold War solidified and the United States, the Soviet Union, and their respective allies embarked on a new geopolitical struggle, some of the remnants of wartime infrastructure were reactivated, albeit for entirely different purposes. The focus on global military presence shifted, and with it, the role of remote islands in the grand strategy. Many airstrips, especially in the Pacific, were retained or repurposed by the United States as part of their new strategy of maintaining a forward presence in the region. Islands that had once been home to vast networks of military airfields now became part of a broader defense network aimed at countering the perceived threat of Soviet expansion. While these bases were no longer active military strongholds in the same way they had been during the war, they remained critical to Cold War geopolitics. Take the example of Johnston Atoll, a small island located about 800 miles west of Hawaii. Once home to a massive complex of airstrips, radar facilities, and fuel storage tanks during World War II, the island was repurposed for strategic use throughout the Cold War. Though its airstrips were not actively used for the same intense combat operations as during the war, the facilities were maintained for a different sort of purpose: nuclear weapons storage, chemical weapons disposal, and as a base for high-altitude reconnaissance flights. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Johnston Atoll became a central hub for U.S. military operations in the Pacific, though its airstrips were repurposed for more specialized needs. Not all of these transitions were driven by military necessity. The end of World War II had, in some places, led to the exploration of new civilian uses for these airstrips. The rapid development of commercial aviation in the post-war years, along with the expanding demand for air travel, led to the repurposing of a few former military airstrips as civilian airports. Some of the most notable examples include airstrips that were situated on islands with commercial tourism potential or key shipping routes. For instance, the airstrip on Midway Atoll, which had once supported large numbers of B-17s and B-24s during the war, was partially repurposed in the 1950s for civilian air travel, as the growing tourist industry in the Pacific began to take shape. However, the story of Midway is far from typical. While the airstrip was kept in operation for a time, it was never fully integrated into the global aviation network. The airstrip remained small and underused, a reflection of the practical limitations of infrastructure on isolated islands. The economic realities of sustaining an airstrip on such a remote island, where logistical support was difficult to maintain and air traffic remained limited, led to the eventual abandonment of Midway's civilian flight operations by the 1960s. The remoteness of the island made it impractical for regular air traffic, and its strategic significance dwindled with time. By the early 1970s, the airstrip had become primarily a staging point for the occasional military exercise rather than a thriving civilian hub. Similarly, in the South Pacific, the vast network of airstrips built during World War II found itself abandoned in the face of changing economic priorities. Many of these islands, such as those in the Solomon Islands or the Marianas, were left behind by the military as the United States turned its attention to new bases in more geopolitically strategic areas. These airstrips, once critical to operations in the Pacific theater, were either left to decay or dismantled. Their concrete runways, once polished and freshly paved to handle the heaviest bombers and cargo planes, cracked under the pressure of time and exposure to the elements. In the case of the Solomon Islands, much of the infrastructure that had supported the war effort, airstrips, bunkers, supply depots, was handed over to local governments, though often without the means to properly maintain or repurpose them. These structures, isolated and difficult to access, became symbols of the economic gap between the Pacific's post-war colonial powers and the newly independent nations that were left to pick up the pieces. As the 1960s progressed, these bases became largely symbolic, reminders of a past that could no longer be sustained. Some islands, like Guadalcanal, had airstrips that were kept open for limited use, but these became increasingly irrelevant as new routes and technologies developed. One of the most enduring legacies of these abandoned airstrips was their eventual integration into the environmental landscape. The remote islands and airfields that had once hosted huge numbers of personnel and military aircraft began to be reclaimed by nature. The tropical climates, heavy rainfall, and seasonal storms eroded the military infrastructure at a rapid pace. The concrete runways began to crack and crumble, and what was once pristine tarmac became overgrown with moss, grass, and local vegetation. Over time, the airstrips that had been so carefully constructed with wartime urgency became forgotten, gradually vanishing beneath layers of nature's quiet reclamation. On many of the Pacific Islands, the remnants of wartime airstrips have become a bizarre intersection of history and ecology. In places like Tinian, where airstrips had once supported the launch of the atomic bomb, the runways have slowly become an odd feature of the landscape. The remnants of massive, reinforced concrete runways now serve as quiet historical markers, obscured by the natural growth of tropical flora. Yet, for all their obsolescence, they are still occasionally visited by those interested in the history of World War II or the ongoing efforts to preserve what little remains of these sites. Despite their gradual abandonment, some airstrips had their final chapter in a much more symbolic context. In the 1980s, the United States began to turn over several of the Pacific Islands and their bases to the nations they had been occupying since the war's end. The once mighty airstrips were handed back to local governments, often with little to no infrastructure remaining. In the case of islands like Wake Island, the airfields were handed over to the government of the newly formed Republic of the Marshall Islands, where their maintenance and purpose were left to the local economy, which was still struggling with the residual effects of colonialism. The islands in the Pacific were also increasingly seen as important for environmental conservation efforts, as the rise of global awareness about climate change, endangered species, and environmental degradation led to new efforts to preserve the natural resources on these islands. At Wake Island, the airstrips, though still intact, began to be seen as a part of the island's broader ecological and historical importance. The need to preserve these environments from overdevelopment meant that the airfields, while not fully restored to operational use, became part of the preservation narrative.